Hi, this is Sheb. Welcome to the Faith Colloquium podcast. Today, my guest is Abigail Favale. Abigail earned her PhD in English from the University of St. Andrews, and she teaches at George Fox University. And she's the author of a new book, Into the Deep, An Unlikely Catholic Conversion, which we'll be talking about today. Abigail, thanks for talking with me.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah. Tell me about what your religious upbringing was as a child. Did you grow up in a Christian family? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I grew up in an evangelical Christian family. So my parents were both converts in college with Campus Crusade for Christ. And so when they got married, they were kind of in that stream of Christianity, and that's what I grew up in. I remember my childhood, being full of focus on the family materials, and the Cooper Kids Adventure series was one of my favorite books when I was a kid. They were published by, I think, Baker. So it was a very, mainstream evangelical and a very, I would say, seriously Christian home. Okay.
And in your book, you talk about kind of growing up inside of a evangelical bubble, inside of a Mormon bubble. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. So I was born in Idaho, and then my childhood, my main childhood where I began to form long-term memories up until hitting puberty was in southern Utah. And then we returned to Idaho, eastern Idaho. So the southern Utah and eastern Idaho locations are very heavily Mormon. And so I really came of age in that environment, in kind of an evangelical bubble inside a highly Mormon area, kind of this, like a Russian nesting doll of religious conservatism, you might say.
Okay.
Yeah.
And as a kid, did you think about, theological questions? Was that something that was pressing on your mind?
I think it was mainly, when I began to be aware of the fact that not all of my friends were Christian in the way I understood Christianity, that sparked some preliminary discussions about apologetics. And primarily, there wasn't a lot of maybe emphasis on theology, but there was more of an emphasis on maybe defending the truths of evangelical Christianity against Mormonism, or perhaps looking at some of the flaws in Mormonism and how they compared to evangelical Christianity. So I would say that it was more of a perhaps defensive approach to apologetics, if that makes sense. So yeah, I would learn about Mormonism from evangelical perspectives, in a way that made Christianity just look much more reasonable.
Yeah.
And, founded in the Bible and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Okay. So all throughout high school, you're kind of in this evangelical family context. Mm-hmm. And then you go off to college. Mm-hmm. And you go to a evangelical college?
I do. I went to George Fox as an undergrad. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I didn't realize this until I was actually looking at your profile on your faculty webpage, but you majored in philosophy.
I did. I majored in philosophy.
Okay. Yeah. And did you like that major?
I loved philosophy. So this was my first encounter with philosophy was in college. I had no real encounter with philosophy in high school, except maybe a little bit I was in speech and debate, and every once in a while you'd come across some philosophical sources for arguments and that sort of thing. But my first real exposure was in a philosophy class when I was a freshman. And I found it riveting. I found it so freeing to begin to ask really difficult questions and to wrestle with them and be invited into that, because I think I had absorbed this idea that you're not supposed to examine Christianity, right? You can put Mormonism on the witness stand and ask it, difficult questions, but that kind of examination, especially in a way that wasn't just based on the Bible, but kind of ran alongside it. There was this whole other stream of argumentation on the basis of reason that I'd never really encountered before. So yeah, I loved it. I found it really fascinating.
Yeah. So you talk about how the philosophy professor made the students write a paper arguing that God doesn't exist and that abortion is morally justified and things like this. Uh-huh. Was that strange for you? Was it difficult to do, or did you actually enjoy that?
It was very difficult, and I enjoyed it.
Okay.
In fact, I remember the hardest paper, I think, was the abortion one, because at the time I couldn't imagine an argument in favor of abortion because it was so, there was not even a question in my mind that an unborn child was a human being. So I was like, how do you argue philosophically that it's okay to kill an innocent human being,
Yeah.
And so I think I tried the tack where it was kind of like a tumor, like it's a tumor and it's invasive and,
Yeah.
So I didn't in any way think that it was a compelling argument, but I found it freeing to be asked to make an argument that you don't actually believe, but you have to kind of try to give an account for, give evidence for. So yeah, I think it could be easy to misunderstand those paper assignments as trying to like undermine or challenge, maybe at a secular university that would be what it's doing. But our professor was a very devout Christian and he was very much trying to get us to engage with our faith on the level of reason.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I loved it.
Yeah. And you mentioned that he was actually an Anglican priest. Is that right?
He was. Yep. Yeah.
Okay. And that was kind of your first introduction into liturgical worship.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So yeah, tell us about that. Did you like that style of worship?
Yeah. He was, my professor was a philosophy professor and also a priest of a very small Anglican, one of those kind of conservative offshoots in the Anglican Communion. And he had a church in his living room where every Sunday at 5 p.m. we would go to his house and have Eucharist. And it was a very small gathering, and it was my first time really experiencing, I would say, a high church liturgical environment. I had briefly gone to a Missouri Synod church in high school, so I was sort of familiar a little bit with that, but it was my first time really, I think, understanding or trying to understand that form of worship, and I really loved it. I loved the idea of the communion of saints. I loved what little I understood of the sacramental theology that was coming through. It was refreshing just to have something that was interactive and embodied rather than passive, kind of sitting and listening to someone speak for a long time.
Yeah.
So having the Eucharist be the culmination of the worship service, I really loved. I loved that.
Yeah. So while you're studying philosophy, you're also kind of going through this journey thinking about women throughout Scripture. Is that fair?
Yeah.
And you're in this New Testament class and you are reading through 1 Corinthians, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So tell us about what happened there.
Right. So we were reading through 1 Corinthians, and it was, I believe, 1 Corinthians 11, where there's a passage. Now, I think the NIV is something like, man is the glory of God and woman is the glory of man. And when I read that for the assigned reading, I thought, wait a second, right? This seems to imply that men are closer to God than women. Like, that can't be right, So I asked the professor what was going on there. And I don't remember exactly what he said, but he kind of did a little maneuvering around the question, was like, whoa, let's look over here, talk about something else. And because I didn't get a satisfactory answer in that class, I started to try to research my own answers. And so I went to the library back in the day when you would go and do research in a library.
Right.
And I remember roaming through the halls and seeing this like very short, small section on feminist theology and feminist biblical criticism. And so I started reading some of those sources, and I was instantly hooked, right? I instantly became a feminist. I thought it was great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So at George Fox, do they have a position on women in church ministry or anything like that? What was the kind of, I guess, cultural climate of women in ministry or women in leadership? So
I would say it's a little bit different now than it was, let's say, 15 years ago. I'm getting so old. But it's a Quaker evangelical school. So there is a tradition of, in the Quaker tradition, there's never been a problem with women in ministry. They don't really have ordained ministry. Yeah. But you're kind of a recorded minister, and women have always been allowed in that role. So I think George Fox, following that tradition, has always been pro women in ministry. Yeah. But when I was a student, it was still very avant-garde to be a feminist. Okay. To identify oneself as a feminist, to be outspoken about it. I think there was a lot of negativity about the word. And so I think I only had maybe, I knew a handful of other students who would have called themselves feminists. That was kind of it. Yeah. And maybe 3 professors. Yeah. And I think now feminism has become a lot more popular, a lot more mainstream in pop culture.
Yeah.
I kind of use the phrase pop feminism a lot. There's just this kind of like, oh yeah, of course, like we're all feminists, like men and women are equal. And so now I sometimes have conversations with female students who feel this pressure to really kind of identify as a feminist.
Right.
But that they may not want to for some reason. So that's very different. I think now there's more cultural pressure, not necessarily from the evangelical world, but I think even there too, I think it's becoming more mainstream as well. So I think that has changed.
Okay.
Not just because of George Fox, but because more, I think the culture around George Fox has changed.
Okay. Yeah. I don't know about you, but for me, when I had to give a lecture on Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex for one of my undergrad classes. And that was like my first introduction to feminism. And as someone who grew up in a similar kind of conservative evangelical house, I think there's a bit of a tug to be kind of liberal-ish, know? And so I remember asking one of my feminist friends at the time, can guys be feminists? I think I'm a feminist.
Yeah.
Was there any of that psychologically for you, the sense of like, oh yeah, I kind of want to go against what's traditional or normal or anything like that?
Yeah, no, I think that was part of it. It wasn't all of it. I think there were some genuine intellectual questions I had, that brought me into feminism. But I do have a contrarian streak. That is definitely true. And so I think that helped. I liked being the feminist.
Right.
I liked sort of trying to evangelize feminism, get people on board.
Right.
So for sure, that was part of it.
So you talk about how like initially it was just kind of reading these biblical texts in a way that kind of made room for women and men being equal. But then it kind of turned into like, no, the Bible actually is this kind of patriarchal, oppressive text that needs to be critiqued and things like that.
Yeah, at some point it switched. And so initially I think I was bringing feminism onto, I don't know, you might say like an evangelical platform where you have this foundation of divine revelation and scripture being infallible. And so the feminist work that interested me was in correctly interpreting scripture in a way that affirmed the equality of men and women, and especially that affirmed women in church leadership. And so, from that position, you take the Bible seriously, and the goal is still that it is authoritative, and you're trying to interpret it correctly, right? But then at some point, I think as I just got more deeply immersed in feminist thought and feminist theology, I began to develop more of an attitude of suspicion, even anger toward the Bible. And it was no longer about getting the Bible right, understanding the Bible correctly. It was about fixing the Bible, kind of critiquing what was wrong with it, revising it as needed, ignoring parts of it that were clearly patriarchal. And so then that really sort of undermined, I think, that evangelical platform where you have this foundation of scriptural authority. I think I'd kind of left that wagon behind.
Yeah. Yeah, you got this great line where you write, Christianity was in need of redemption, and I was the feminist prophet come to rescue my religion from itself. That makes me think of a lot of other people.
Yeah, when I was writing this book, part of my research for it was reading through my old journals. And it was really unsettling sometimes, the kind of hubris that would come through in some of the things that I was writing. I really did think that it was my job to fix Christianity, and that I knew what was true.
Right.
Better than the Bible or Christian tradition.
Yeah. So you go off to graduate school, and in graduate school, where are you at in terms of your faith?
I would say in graduate school, that was probably the least Christian era of my life.
Okay.
For sure. So during that time, I wasn't practicing at all. I wasn't going to church. I wasn't praying. I think if you'd pressed me, I would have still considered myself a Christian, but I was very much trying to figure out what that meant. And any way that I would have used the label at the time would have been in a very kind of postmodern sense.
Yeah.
Like, not that any of this is necessarily objectively true. We can't really know what's objectively true, but there's, something beautiful about this story. And so in graduate school, I was doing research. So I was getting a degree in feminist theory and women's writing. But what I was researching was how contemporary women writers were using theological concepts in their fiction. So I still had this interest in Christian theology, especially in the idea of incarnation. but it was like a purely intellectual interest at that point. Like all of my kind of energy, my kind of spirituality just retreated into this kind of purely intellectual interest.
Yeah.
I wasn't practicing really at all.
Did you have people around you that were practicing Christians?
No.
Okay.
The only two I knew, like from a distance, some other grad students that were practicing Christians, including this one guy who was such a jerk that it was sort of, I mean, he would just like make fun of me because I was a feminist. You know? He would kind of be like, oh, you know, you're like a free spirit, you know? And so I steered clear of him. And then, yeah, all of my other compatriots were, you know, secular atheists, I think. So
okay.
That was my world.
Okay. But you wouldn't have described yourself as an atheist?
No.
Okay. You also talk a lot about how you were drawn to what it seems like is just the aesthetic beauty and architecture of kind of these ancient churches.
Yeah. You know, it's funny, in the first flat we lived in St. Andrews, it's right across this, you know, narrow cobblestone street from the local Catholic parish. And I never once went in there, not once. And I could look out my bedroom window right into kind of the front door. And one of my twinging regrets that I'll have in passing is that I was so close to that. I never went in there once, you know. But when I traveled around the continent a little bit, when I was living over there, I went to Notre Dame in Paris, for example, and I went to Poland. That was a wonderful trip there and got to see a lot of beautiful churches. When I would go into sacred spaces, I would feel a kind of encounter there. You know, there was something there that I still longed for, and I couldn't find out how to kind of connect with it at that time in my life. I think I was so far from God in every other way. But then when I would have kind of proximity to that, you know, I would have this desire for it, but then not sure what to do with that desire.
Yeah. And not knowing what to do with that desire, was that partly just kind of these intellectual, like, this is where I'm at intellectually, that doesn't fit with what I'm sensing or what I feel when I walk into these churches?
Yeah, I mean, my Christianity had become so nominal and so individualistic
that
I didn't really know how to engage with Christianity in any other way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At some point, you start thinking more seriously about Catholicism. Can you tell us a little bit about how that happened?
Yeah, I mean, it's it's weird because it's not like I was beginning to think about Catholicism. I really began to seriously think about Catholicism right after I became Catholic. That's the weird part about my story. But
okay,
here, I'll give you an example from sort of this period in my life. So this is probably after I'm already done with graduate school. I think I've begun teaching at this point. And so I'm trying kind of more actively to return to Christianity in some way, but having a hard time figuring out how to do that. So I'm kind of going to a Quaker church service here or an Episcopalian church service here, you know, but never really being able to find a home anywhere. And at this time, my parents lived in Washington, D.C., and I went to visit them. And they lived close to the CUA, Catholic University of America, where there's the Basilica, the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception is there, and they have this incredible church. And I remember going there with my mom and feeling this experience that was very conflicting. Like on the one hand, I felt like just this very strong pull toward the beauty there, especially the Marian shrines that are on the crypt level. And I was in the bookstore, like looking at all these little saint medallions, you know, just like, oh, I love it. But then I also was really repelled in some ways. Like in the Basilica itself, there's this huge mosaic of very much this like victorious Jesus who looks kind of angry, which I sort of dig now. But at the time I was like, oh, but there's this angry masculine figure, you know? So that was kind of my relationship with Christianity, like both strongly attracted and strongly repelled simultaneously. And I think I'd had for a long time felt a longing toward ancient liturgical Christianity, but I just couldn't go there because of my feminist commitments, you know. So Catholicism especially was just a no-go. They didn't ordain women. They had this weird contraception thing.
Right.
I just couldn't do it, right? Even though there was this kind of visceral longing, when I would be in Catholic spaces for that. So that sort of illustrates where I was at that time. Yeah, so being in a Christian environment was really hard for me and really good for me. I very much see that as an action of divine providence now, that that right out of grad school, that he put me in a Christian institution, because I think if I had been in a totally secular institution, I probably would have just given up on faith altogether. But because it was this continual question, it kept the question of faith at the forefront for me, right? And so when I chose to come work at George Fox, I really wanted to make good on that commitment. I wanted to be a Christian. I wanted to figure out how to do that. And I was trying in good faith to figure that out, but it was so hard. And I couldn't find a church that fit my sort of list of my kind of Goldilocks list of, like aesthetic interests and political commitments,
Right.
And so what sort of happened was I kind of had an escalating spiritual crisis, because the kind of Christianity that I cobbled together for myself wasn't something that could actually sustain anyone spiritually. And because I was also then working in a Christian environment, I began to feel increasingly like a fraud. I'm supposed to be forming my students spiritually.
Right.
And my own faith is such a wreck,
Yeah.
And so that was sort of happening toward the end of my 20s, this kind of escalating spiritual crisis, which then had this professional crisis tied to it, right? And then at the same time, I also became a mother for the first time. And that really rocked my world, especially in terms of feminism. I think where my feminism had been so tied to this idea of my own autonomy and independence.
Yeah.
And then when I became a mother, it's lost its explanatory power, I guess. The narrative of feminism, it just was no longer quite fit my experience. I had a son as well. So, my world was very much, not only was it not just primarily about myself and my experience and finding my place in the world and the church. Now it was about this other human being, this little male human being, and I was now a mother to a son. And that really changed my own sense of identity and also kind of my concern for the world. And so it wasn't like I lost my feminism or something when I became a mother, but it weakened, I think, the power of that narrative on my thinking enough that God could sneak through again. He could sneak through my defenses. And that's when I became very suddenly Catholic.
Okay. So I've got a couple of questions and thoughts. When you talk about being a mother and how that kind of toned down whatever feminism you had, I'm just curious, was the feminism that you were in, because I feel like there's all this language about women are goddesses, they're their bodies are super powerful, right? So it seems like feminism and birth go really well together in that sense, right?
Yes.
But that wasn't the case for your experience.
Well, it wasn't, like I said, at first that's kind of where, I went with it. It wasn't like I kind of, I became a mother and then I was like, oh, I'm, done with feminism.
Yeah.
But it was almost like during this time of my life, I started to, I guess, notice kind of some fissures in the narrative before that I hadn't really noticed. I think also becoming a mother, I experienced the full force of my femaleness for the first time in my life. And it kind of just it rattled some of my very egalitarian assumptions about the interchangeability of men and women. When, my husband's very involved, he's a stay-at-home dad, he raises kids, he does domestic labor, but, when we had an infant, there were just some things he could not do for me. Yeah. Right. Especially in the infancy stage.
Right.
And so that it wasn't as though I was like, oh, feminism is, wrong. It was more like, okay, these assumptions that I had just taken almost at face value, I began to ask questions.
Yeah.
The sort of totalizing feminist narrative that I'd accepted began to seem a little less compelling, or at least simplistic, I guess.
So it sounds like the autonomy piece was like really central to your feminism.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I would say, of course, there's a great, variety out there. But I would honestly say, like, modern Western feminism, autonomy is a prime virtue of that. So I don't think it was just me, but I do think that generally speaking, modern Western feminism tends to be very much, because, you talked about Simone de Beauvoir, the second sex, right? And I think that that's very much kind of a cascade text for American feminism.
Yeah.
And she very much defines human flourishing as, transcending one's biological facticity, right? In order to gain this kind of transcendent autonomy. Like, that's what the goal of human life is. And so then if that's the framework that you're in, then female biology becomes a threat.
Yeah.
It might be powerful, but it also makes you very vulnerable.
Yeah.
It makes you tied to children in a way that men are not.
Yeah.
So it was kind of just like, becoming aware and experiencing these things for the first time that began to sort of shift my thinking a little.
You've talked about how of what Simone de Beauvoir is doing is saying, like, well, in order to be feminine, you actually kind of have to be more like a male.
Yeah. Yeah, that's her model of freedom, is for women to become as much like men as is possible.
Yeah. So with the Catholic piece of it, it wasn't the case that you had kind of been like, okay, I've come to intellectual satisfaction with all these different elements of Catholicism, and now I'm gonna now I can sign the line or whatever.
Yeah. No.
There were things that you were working through still, it sounds like.
Yes. Yeah. I think the best way of describing it is that for about a decade, I had a longing toward Anglo-Catholic Christianity, but then my feminism sort of prevented me from following it. And then when my feminism was, I guess, weakened just enough that longing kind of broke through, and I just followed it really kind of suddenly and became Catholic. And then it was really, once I joined the church at Easter, that I began to really wrestle with some of the questions that I still had. It was almost like I kind of suspended my disbelief about certain things in order to just, I was just desperate. I was spiritually desperate at that point, honestly.
Yeah.
And really, it was the grace of God, I think, moving in my life, that it just kind of like pushed me over it just pushed me into the church before I had a chance to really talk myself out of it.
Yeah.
And then once I was in there, I was like, oh, great. Okay, now I actually have to figure this out,
Right. So at the time, on an existential level, did you feel like, yeah, this feels like the right thing to do?
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. I did. And I also, I knew a number of Catholics who don't agree with all the teachings of the church.
Yeah.
And so that sort of, I think, allowed me to not be freaked out about the things that I had problems with.
Okay.
I didn't feel this sense that I had to resolve those before I became Catholic.
Okay. And what's your family and friends? Like, what are they thinking at this point?
That's a great question. Honestly, I don't even, my friends must have thought I was crazy.
Okay.
I mean, I was, a big part of my professional identity was being like this known feminist, progressive, on the Christian campus.
Right.
I had a reputation for that, and then I kind of really suddenly, it was even sudden for me, and I was kind of experiencing it, at least in my own head. But for other people who weren't able to see some of what was going on inside me, because so much of this was an internal struggle, for them, it must have seemed really sudden and bizarre. So I think it perplexed a lot of people. And my family, I think they were really relieved, just to see me come back to Christianity, with any kind of enthusiasm. They were fine with it.
Yeah.
And my mom actually has since become Catholic as well. So she was also on her own kind of journey toward Catholicism. And I sort of lapped her. She was more methodical than I was.
Okay.
Yeah.
So a lot of Protestants' biggest issues with Catholicism, papal infallibility, Mariology. Mm-hmm. Were those things that when you joined the church, those were things that you had reached some kind of level of satisfaction with, or were those things you were still thinking through?
Oh, I was fine with those things. The Pope, we're just like, yeah, sure, whatever. He seems like a nice guy.
Yeah.
Which isn't to say I had this like really wonderful understanding of the doctrine of papal authority or anything, but no, it didn't bother me.
Who was the Pope at this time?
It was Francis, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and the stuff around Mary.
Yeah, no, Mary, I loved that. I loved the Mary stuff, although I also did not understand it.
Okay.
I loved the idea of Mary, so it didn't freak me out, even though I didn't have good theology at the time.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm like an Anglican right now. I attend this Anglican church, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think you even talk about this in your book, that when you were attending this Anglican church in college, that this sense of like, I'm part of this Catholic tradition without like sort of fully joining it.
Right. Like you get the best parts without some of the weirder, kind of uber Catholic-y parts,
Right. And I think Anglicanism kind of calls itself like this middle way, right? Between Catholicism and Protestantism. So what are your thoughts and feelings about Protestantism now?
Well, I mean, as I've learned my Catholic faith more deeply, I now have much better reasons for being Catholic than I did when I became Catholic. So I do believe that the Catholic tradition represents the fullness of the Christian faith. But I also, it's interesting in becoming Catholic, for a while, I felt sort of this resentment toward my evangelical upbringing. And now I feel in a way I've returned to it. And I definitely see like my Catholic faith now as this fulfillment of the evangelical faith of my childhood. So in a way, my Catholic conversion was almost like a return. The break I feel is more from the sort of postmodern, almost post-Christian, really, feminism.
Yeah.
And so I really like being in a Protestant environment in a way. I think that might also be because I do have that contrarian streak that I mentioned. So I think it's a good environment for me.
Yeah.
But I do have, for sure, like real theological disagreements with certain Protestant ideas. That's certainly true.
Okay.
But I don't think that, I don't have this perspective that like Protestants aren't somehow Christian. Like I have a very kind of Catholic perspective. Like, if you've been baptized, like you actually are Catholic, you just don't know it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You might be in theological error, but you are definitely, you're part of the body of Christ. We are part of this body. And,
yeah.
And for sure you can have like a very like vibrant, real faith in Jesus Christ as a Protestant, all that sort of stuff, of course.
Yeah. So why not like the Eastern Orthodox Church? Was that part of something you thought about as you were thinking through finding a tradition to join?
Yeah. I mean, I never seriously considered Orthodoxy. I do remember reading, when I was in kind of that searching place where I really wanted to return to Christianity. But I remember reading The Orthodox Way by Bishop Callistos.
Yeah.
And it was really good. I had a lot of respect for it. And I think in general, my theological leanings tend to be a little more Eastern in Catholicism. So I really like the kind of Eastern Fathers, the Eastern mystics. And the nice thing about the Catholic tradition is you get all of that, right? It's all part of the tradition.
Yeah.
Athanasius on the Incarnation is maybe my favorite book that I've ever read. And I very much love the kind of Byzantine tradition in Christianity. And I appreciate that that's still alive in Catholicism as well. But, I never really considered it. I think partially because it wasn't really on offer. I would have had to really pursue it. Whereas the Catholic Church, there was the local parish was 2 blocks from my house,
Right.
And so I think I need to be kept on a short leash, I think. Yeah. So I was really, for me, it was kind of Catholicism was really the only thing I was pursuing. And I think because I'd been through Anglicanism, I'd experienced different forms of Anglicanism, like a very wonderful experience as an undergrad that was very orthodox in the small O sense, very Christ-centered, took theology very seriously. And I had a wonderful experience in that setting. But then I also experienced some really like theologically wishy-washy, I think, what some might say the beauty of Anglicanism is that you can be an Anglican and believe almost anything.
Yeah.
But for me, that was bad because it allowed me to, kind of hold on to my really sort of heretical views for a long time. It didn't really ask anything of me. And
sure.
And for me, that ended up being a very spiritually unhealthy kind of situation to have that sort of freedom, which isn't to say there aren't Catholics that believe whatever they want, disagree with the Catholic Church, but there at least is a clear, you're dissenting, what you're dissenting from.
Right.
So you can disagree with the idea of transubstantiation, but you know that you're going against what is established doctrine. And so that kind of clarity and that sort of authority was really important for me in actually coming back to faith, to have a clear sense of authority that wasn't just myself, that wasn't just me figuring out what I thought was best.
Yeah.
And I think in an Anglican setting, I was still able to do that to my own detriment, I guess.
Yeah. What is it that you think Protestants misunderstand about Catholicism and maybe miss out? Like, what's the thing that we really miss out about by not being Catholic?
The thing that's probably most misunderstood would be the Pope and Mary, like those things you just mentioned, which we can circle back to and talk more about. And I would say the thing that most missing out on would be the sacraments. And I know that there are some forms of Protestantism, where you get some sacraments there, but even in Anglicanism, the full sort of 7 sacraments are kind of reduced, and there isn't, say, like the regular sacrament of confession.
Yeah.
So for me, the sacraments have been absolutely essential in having a strong faith. And the grace that I've received in living the sacramental life has just, it's hard to say, it sounds so cliche. It's changed my life, but it's completely changed my worldview. It's changed my marriage. It's given me a Christian faith that I never dreamed I could possibly have. I just thought something was wrong with me. I thought, I don't have the right kind of muscle. I don't have the muscle of faith. I'm just going to have to be a doubting Christian. But that's not true, and for me, the sacraments have been so essential. My theology of how we are united to Christ, it's not just through belief, but it's also this sacramental bond by which we become Christ in a very real way. And that's how we're united to him. That's how his salvific work extends to us. That's what it means that we are all one body. And that kind of sacramental grace and the unity that comes from that, I could never leave that behind,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. With your kind of feminist framework, how did you think about the fact that this church is full of male priests and bishops and all of that? And then I guess also just more generally about Christianity, the fact that there's Jesus, who's a male savior, and he appoints these 12 apostles, right? And we're all men.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what are you thinking about all of that?
Yeah, I think growing up, here's another sort of, weakness that I experienced in Protestantism is that it seems like in the full kind of canopy of the Christian cosmos, what is feminine has been kind of lopped off in Protestantism. You don't have Mary, not in any really kind of significant way. You no longer have the sense of a visible church, especially a church that is our mother, right? So in the Catholic world, we talk about Mary as our mother. We talk about the church as our mother. And so you have that kind of language alongside the language of God as Father, and then also the maleness of Christ and the priesthood. And so it no longer feels sort of like overwhelmingly masculine to me. Now it seems like you have both male and female, masculine and feminine together. And I think now with a more sacramental understanding of reality, I understand the kind of symbolic and spiritual significance of bodily sex. The fact that we are male and female means that we're kind of, we're icons that represent different aspects of divine reality. And that is something that's being staged during Mass. It's a wedding banquet every Mass. So you have Christ as the bridegroom and the gathered people as the bride. And then every Mass is the wedding banquet. And so the maleness of the priest, who is, basically just an icon of Christ who was male, that makes sense to me now that I'm thinking of it sacramentally and symbolically rather than just, oh, it's a man and he's a priest because he has leadership capabilities, right? He gets to be a priest because he's male. And so he can display, he can serve as an icon in a way that I can't. But that doesn't mean that I can't also be Christ or exemplify Christ in other ways. But in this kind of liturgical drama, it makes sense why the priesthood is male. And so I actually think that's beautiful because the whole picture's been restored, right? And that was something I just couldn't understand before I was Catholic because I was only seeing part of the picture.
Yeah, that's helpful. Maybe this will be the last thing I ask you. I'm just curious to hear you flesh out a little bit more about what you think about maybe pop feminism today. My wife grew up in India, and so she's got all these mixed feelings about how the way that feminism is talked about because she's, experienced and witnessed all kinds of harassment growing up on the streets of India. And then coming here, it's like kind of strange to hear people talk about women being oppressed in these kind of like in a democratized way. And so, yeah, I'm just curious what your thoughts are on kind of pop feminism and if there's ways to still keep a lot of feminism and incorporate it into Christianity, or if it's already within Christianity, or just what your thoughts about all of this are.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just based on what you said about what your wife thinks, I think I would totally agree with her. So I absolutely think that misogyny exists, that there are places in the world where women are absolutely oppressed in very real and systemic ways. But I don't think that Western developed nations, like America, I don't think that's the case. And so one of the problems with pop feminism is that it has a very simplistic narrative that women are sort of always in the position of being oppressed, and that male power, patriarchal power is so endemic that it's just almost like the air we breathe. But that kind of a narrative becomes just self-perpetuating, right? And so I'm increasingly seeing among some of my very gifted, very talented, very ambitious female students this almost victim mentality because they've been taught to see themselves as victims in this patriarchal society, when in fact, like they could go to an Ivy League school and, be the next CEO of whatever. Like there's nothing holding them back except themselves and this sort of self-defeating narrative that keeps perpetuating itself. So, I'm very much interested in and concerned about, instances of, female oppression around the globe. But I think in Western developed culture, the bar for what oppression is just keeps going like lower and lower and lower, right? Where now like, oh, if a man interrupts me, suddenly that's a sign of patriarchal power and I'm being oppressed. That kind of mentality I think is just toxic and absurd. And I really want to resist it. So I don't know. It's kind of my thoughts on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At the end of your book, you talk about how wonderful it is to have your husband going through the liturgy with you at home, things like that. Yeah. Was there anything else that you feel like you wanted to share or that we haven't talked about that's worth discussing?
Oh, well, there's so much we could talk about. I mean, you did ask as part of your last question about the relationship between feminism and Christianity. And I think I would say this, that you can be a Christian and you can be a feminist, but you're going to have to be a heretic.
Okay.
In one way. You're either going to have to be a feminist heretic.
Okay.
Or you're going to have to be a Christian heretic. Because I do think that when you get down to the sort of level of philosophical framework, there are some incompatible assumptions about the world at work. So I'm definitely in support of Christian feminism, but I do get suspicious when it begins to look just basically like secular feminism with a little bit of a gloss on it, with maybe some Jesus thrown on top, that's not. I think Christian feminism, to be authentically Christian, is going to look pretty different from secular feminism from the ground up.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to have a different attitude toward motherhood. I think it's going to have a very pro-life bent to it.
Okay.
In terms of protecting human life from conception till natural death, So I think it's going to look pretty different. I think it's going to be more communal than individualistic. It's not going to see self-sacrifice as something negative, but actually something to be praised. It shouldn't be primarily concerned about earthly power. So I think, it's still something I'm working out in my own mind in terms of what my own, how to work this out even in my own thought. But that is, I think, a conclusion I've come to pretty recently that, I think Christian feminism should exist, but I also think it should look different than secular feminism in pretty marked ways.
Yeah, that's good. Well, I certainly recommend the book. It's called Into the Deep, an Unlikely Catholic Conversion. You write beautifully, but you also have this like snark in your writing that comes out really well.
Thank you.
Yeah, my wife and I have really appreciated your book.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. Abigail, thanks for talking with me.
Yeah, that was fun. That was great.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please subscribe and please share with your friends.